Hello there everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our video series on creating the Etch sketch project from the Odin project. In the first part, we added our slider to, let's go to our index.html. We added our slider to our HTML file right here. In our HTML file, index.html, the slider we added has a container with an ID of slider container. So the first thing we're going to do is put that, we're going to select the slider container, okay, put in our curly brackets, and we'll only put in a margin here, a margin of 0 and auto, so that it helps center the container. Okay, so we don't really see that here because it's centering the whole container. Let me see if we can still sort of see how it's working. Okay, so if we have sketch area here, we increase that a bit. We have our slider, our slider container. So if we, okay, so this is our slider container. That's what we centered. So actually, the width is already the whole 100% of the parent width. You see, it just goes all the way through when I highlight it. Okay, but we just move on and also select the slider class. Okay, so if you check our index.html, we have our slider class. Let me reduce this again. So we are selecting the slider class, and we'll put in a couple of CSS. We use a WebKit dash appearance, and is equal to none. We are basically setting some default stuff to some default styling to none, or we are removing some default styling rather. Let me say it that way. So the other one is appearance. So appearance is none. And then we have height. Okay, now we'll set the height to 25 pixels to get the UI I want to get. And then the width we also set to 100%, and the background should also be, we use RGB, so RGBA, okay, because we also want to set the opacity. I don't know if you know about this RGB color, but I'm sure you can do some research and learn about it. But basically, we are setting a specific color with sort of a specific amount of that color or opacity, or however you want to call it. So that's why we have 4 values, but you can do some search about that to understand it better if you don't really understand that. Okay, so these are the values we'll be using for this background property. Okay, then the next thing is we'll also add another property called outline, and we'll set that one to none. Okay, so we don't want any outline. Opacity, we'll also set that to 0.7. Then WebKit transition, should be 0.2 seconds. And then transition should be opacity 0.2 seconds. Okay, let's save and see. What we have. Okay, so if we look at it, this is what we have. We've removed the outline, we've removed some of the default values, set our opacity. Okay, and we set the background color to this color right here, and this is what we have at the moment. So if we click on this, we can slide it. Okay, so that's great. We'll move on to changing the or adding some styles to the slider value. So we go margin will be equal to 0 and auto. This will center. Control save. Then we'll say text align. Text align center. Okay, so we move on from the slider value. We go to slider. It's also an ID. Slider hover. So whenever we hover over our slider, we want to change the opacity. So we use opacity and we set it to 1. Okay, so you see that whenever I put my cursor or my mouse, over the slider, the opacity changes, it gets darker, Okay, so we can also move on to okay, for this one, we don't want to use a slider ID, we want to use a slider class. Okay, so let's change that, not the ID, okay, but the class. So we use dot. Okay, so let's save that. We still have the same effect. Okay, then we move on to the next one, which is we'll still select the same slider, but this time we're going for WebKit dash slider dash thumb. Okay, so we are selecting what they are calling the thumb of the slider. Okay, and so this is like a built-in property or default value, but we want to switch some of the properties up to make them our own. Okay, so we can just go WebKit dash appearance, and we'll set that to none, remove the default. Then we go to appearance and also set that to none. Then the width to 25 pixels. Okay. After setting the width to 25 pixels, we can go on to the height and set that to 25 pixels also. Then we go to the background and give it this color over here, #04AA60. We will just move on to also change our cursor over here. So we add the cursor property and we change that to pointer. We can go ahead and save that, and then that's what we get over here. This becomes a square, and we get the color that we are looking for, and we change our cursor, we set the height and the width, and this is what we get. Okay, so great so far. We're again going to do the next thing, which is to select the slider, and this time we want to do something specific, I think, for Mozilla. So it comes with Moz, which is also a specific sort of CSS. that we are selecting, and then we'll change some of the defaults. Okay, so that's dash most dash range dash thumb. Okay, so I think the thumb is what we did for the general websites, but this works specifically for Mozilla. Okay, so we can come down, we just set the width and the height to 25 pixels like we did. And then the background to a color hash 04, the same thing up there, AA AA6D. And finally, we want to change the cursor to a pointer. Okay, so that should also work on a Mozilla browser. So you can slide that. Everything is looking good so far. So as we can see, there's this big space between our slider and the sketch area. So if we scroll up in our style.css file, we can go up to our sketch area and we realize that there is a margin of 100 pixels and auto. The first part, as I'm sure you already know, deals with the margin at the top and the margin at the bottom. So it's saying that the margin at the bottom should be 100 pixels, and we don't actually want that. We want to change the margin to 100 pixels at the top, auto at the right, then 0 pixels at the bottom, and then auto at the left. Sorry about that, auto. Okay, so just to recap it a little bit, 100 pixels at the top. Okay, that's how it goes when you put 4 values into the margin or padding property. So for the margin property, in this case, we have put 100 pixels at the top. The next value, auto, goes round to this side, auto at the right, okay, then 0 at the bottom, and then auto at the left. So that's how it goes: top, right, bottom, left. If it's 2 values, it's top, bottom, right, left. If it's 1 value, then it's 1 value for every single margin around the element. Okay, and it works the same way for padding. Okay, so let's save this and have a look at what happens. Okay, so it just quickly removes the margin so the slider hits it directly. Okay, so the next thing I would like us to do is to remove the box shadow we added earlier, just because it sort of doesn't make much sense anymore, because we've moved our slider all the way flush right below our sketch area. So let's remove the box shadow and let's save that. Now the next thing we'll do is to go to our script.js and try to hook up the functionality. In the previous video, we brought in our slider container, slider, and our slider value, and we even set a value for our text content of our slider value. Okay, so we put that there. Let me reduce this a little bit. Okay, so the next thing is that we are going to add a listener, and we're going to do it this way. We're just going to get our slider, we're going to put dot, then we're going to use the on input listener, then we're going to put a function to that. Okay, so this is another way we can add a listener. basically. So we can just put a function, and in the function we are going to create a variable called txt. We're going to say it's equal to, we use backticks, so you can use a string literal. So our dollar sign, curly braces, then we say this dot value, and then we just put here x dollar sign this dot value. Okay, so basically what we are doing here is we are just creating a variable for the value that will be shown in slider value. Okay, so we are using a string literal to create that, and we are using variables so that when it changes, it will also change over here. So finally over here we add our brackets and the word resolution. Okay, so it's just mimicking what we have right here, or what we set as default right here. Let's make this a small x. Great, our semicolon. Then the next thing we do is get the slider value dot inner HTML. So we want to get the inner HTML and put a value there. We say that it's equal to the variable we just created, txt. And then we want to remove grid cells when there's an input made. And then we want to create grid cells, and we'll use this dot value. So this is not too complex, it's pretty simple. We just get our slider, then we add the listener for the on input event, then we create a function that will be called. We created a variable which is the string literal for what we have here. Okay, then we get our slider value, then we change the inner HTML, we assign this value in. Then what we do is we remove cells. So we check all the cells and we remove them. So the moment there's an input value given to this slider, like I move the slider a little bit, that's an input value and it has a specific number. That's what we are referring to over here as this value. It's going to write those values into the inner HTML, and then we are going to remove all the grid cells using this function. Then we are going to create another set of grid cells, but this time we use this dot value, which is the new value that we've assigned over here. Okay, so we see that when we slide, as the value changes, the number of cells increase. We can slide over them. Sketching is also working, so that's pretty awesome. We can reduce it and we have bigger cells but fewer cells. So our slider is hooked up and it's working perfectly in my opinion.